Chef, restaurant critic of the New York Times, memoirist, editor of Gourmet magazine for its last 10 years in existence, Ruth Reichl has occupied the very center of American food culture, as well as its cutting edge, at every iteration of her career. She has won 4 James Beard Awards for the whole gamut of writing formats, for restaurant criticism, for journalism, and for her own books. Her trilogy of very fine and very frank food memoirs include Tender at the Bone, Comfort Me with Apples, and Garlic and Sapphires. We also hosted her here back in 2009 to a very packed store, just like today, and one deep in mourning for Gourmet magazine, for her memoir, Not Becoming My Mother, which has since been published under the title For You, Mom, Finally, which is a title that we found has sold a lot better on Mother's Day. In 2009, she also edited and published the gold standard, although it is neon green, cookbook, Gourmet Today. Since Gourmet's closing, Reichl has kept very busy with an online venture called Guilt Taste for 2 years, and now with fiction, which is what brings us here today. Her newly published novel called Delicious is a delightfully readable, food-centric novel that draws on her experiences and her exposures, whilst being, and you'll know this if you've read any of the press surrounding the book, emphatically non-autobiographical. We're delighted to welcome Ruth Reichl to the store today. Please help me in welcoming her.
I feel like I always bring bad weather to Washington. When it started raining on the train today, I thought, oh, I'm doing it again. I apologize. I thought I would begin by telling you how this book came to be in the first place. And it's pretty much started when I was on tour for the Big Green, the second gourmet cookbook. And when you're on book tour, it's a very odd thing because you end up having these little pockets of time where you're in towns where you don't know anyone. And what I usually do is end up in used bookstores or thrift stores. And I'm always going to the cookbooks, but what I'm really looking for are not the cookbooks, but beneath the cookbooks, there's usually a bottom shelf, and they have these boxes filled with odd ephemera, things that come out of flour bags. And there's little handwritten cookbooks that people used to keep where they would, tear things out and then paste them into these notebooks. And I'm sort of fascinated by those and collect them. So I was in an old bookstore, and I found this pile of stuff from World War II that I'd never seen any of this before, and I bought, it was a huge envelope full of it, and I bought it and took it home. And it was pamphlets from the Department of Agriculture on cooking on rations, recipes, how to start a victory garden, ads for the Women's Land Army, which I had never heard of, and the Crop Conservation Corps, and how to repair your farm vehicles during the war. I mean, it was obviously a farm family that had it. And even a Burgess seed catalog from 1943. And as I read through it, I started looking at the recipes, and the recipes that the Department of Agriculture sent out were terrible. I couldn't see how any of them could work. And so then on my other moments on book tour, I started looking for cookbooks from World War II. Prudence Penny, vitamins for vitality. There were a ton of them, and I started collecting those. And as I went through those recipes, I wasn't real pleased with them either. I thought, this must have been really tough during the time of rationing. One recipe was for mayonnaise, how to make a mock mayonnaise, which involved mashing potatoes, putting some mustard into it, and a little bit of oil. And I could not see how that could possibly substitute for mayonnaise. Anyway, I was in Seattle, still on book tour for this book, and I was in a restaurant, and I had very politely turned off my telephone because I was being interviewed by guy from the paper there. And the the manager of the restaurant comes over and tells me that I have a phone call. And I'm instantly terrified that something terrible has happened to somebody in my family. My son has had an accident. My husband's had a heart attack. And I go and pick up the phone, and the voice I hear is my boss. So there's this moment of huge relief. Nothing terrible has happened to the family, but then why is he calling me? And he said, you have to come back to New York. And I said, no, I'm in Seattle. I'm on tour for the book. I have to be in Portland tomorrow. And he said, no, you have to come home. You have to be here. And I said, well, can you give me a hint? And he said, no, just come back. And I didn't think it was good. I figured I was probably getting fired. But I never in a million years imagined that I would be standing there the next morning when they announced that they were folding the magazine. It was a very sad moment, obviously. The staff, we gathered every bottle of wine that the wine editor had in his office, and he had it was like one of these bookshelves here. And we took it all back to my house and had a wake. And the next day, the rest of the staff went and cleared out their offices and started looking for new jobs. I, on the other hand, was contractually obligated to go back on the road for the book. It was truly one of the weirdest times of my life. This was a book that was not my book. I didn't get a penny for it. And I was on the road for a month and mostly listening to people weeping about the end of the magazine. The book, of course, sold like hotcakes because everybody knew it was the last book that they were ever going to get from Gourmet. And after a month, the book hit the bestseller list, and I got to go home. And the first thing I had to do when I went home was pack up my office. Walking into that office was one of the worst moments of my life. We had this big purple wall when you walked in that had these letters that spelled out Gourmet. Well, they'd been wrenched off, so there were just these holes there. And all the other magazines, people from the other magazines had come down looting. So, the place was just a shambles. I was sort of wandered through this scene of desolation. There were these big bins in all the halls with every photograph the magazine had ever had. They were just being thrown out, and broken furniture and dying plants. And I went down to the kitchen thinking, well, we had 8 test kitchens, and I thought, well, the kitchens will at least feel like they used to feel. And I went into the kitchens, and they had locked them but neglected to get rid of the food. So it was filled with rotten food. And I went into my office, and I was too depressed to really start packing. So I thought, I'm going to go. There is one room here that will be unchanged, because the last thing I had done before leaving was lock my office. Lock the library. And I went into the library, and the Condé Nast building is just one of those soulless glass and steel high-rises on the corner of 42nd Street and Broadway. And the library was just a windowless office room. But I went in there and closed the door, and the books were all kind of breathing around me, and it was unchanged. It was kind of wonderful. And I sat there sort of trying to get myself ready to go pack my office up. And I noticed off in the distance a metal filing cabinet I had never seen before. And I went and opened this cabinet, and in there were thousands of letters. Probably most of the letters that the magazine had received up until about the 80s. And I started going through them thinking, there's probably a really interesting history of American food buried in here. But in fact, the letters were pretty boring. Most of them were complaints, recipe requests, or recipe submissions. And I thought, I wish I had time to really go through these because I know that there's gold in here. There's something remarkable hidden in here. And I had this moment of thinking, what are they going to do with the letters? And I thought, well, if they're throwing every photograph the magazine ever got away, there's no way they're keeping these letters. It's really a shame. And I went back to my office, and I don't know why I did this, but as a writer, every once in a while, you have a gift. And I suddenly started imagining the letters I wished I had found. And I sat down at my computer, and I spent the afternoon, when I should have been packing, writing the letters that I wanted to have found there. And this is the first one. Dear Mr. Beard, on the radio last spring, President Roosevelt said that each and every one of us here on the home front has a battle to fight. We must keep our spirits up. I am doing my best, but in my opinion, liver gems are a lost cause because they would take the spirit right out of anyone. So when Mother says it's wrong for us to eat better than our brave men overseas, I tell her that I don't see how eating disgusting stuff helps them in the least. But Mr. Beard, it is very hard to cook good food when you're only a beginner. When Mother decided it was her patriotic duty to work at the airplane factory, she should have warned me about recipes. You just can't trust them. Prudence pennies are so revolting, I want to throw them right into the garbage. Mrs. Davis from next door lent me one of her wartime recipe pamphlets, and I read about liver salmi, which sounded so romantic. But by the time I had cooked the liver for 20 minutes in hot water, cut it into little cubes, rolled them in flour, and sautéed them in fat, I'd made flour footprints all over the kitchen floor. The consomme and cream both hissed like angry cats when I added them. Then I was supposed to add stoned olives and taste for seasoning. I spit it right into the sink. Mother looks so tired when she comes home, and I just couldn't give her that salmi for supper. So I buried it in the backyard and made her some fried eggs. I know that waste is wrong, but I had no choice. Tomorrow I'm going to try again. I have my eye on the peanut butter and lima bean loaf from a cookbook Mrs. Davis gave me, which she says is, quote, a model of thrift. That is why I'm writing, Mr. Beard. I know you could do better. Don't you think it would be a good idea if you wrote a cookbook for people like me who are just learning to cook? That could take a while, but in the meantime, I have a question. We're baking cookies at school to send to the soldiers, and I refuse to waste my sugar rations on anything out of these silly books. So could you please, please, please send me a recipe I can trust? I'll be checking the mailbox every day. Sincerely yours, Lulu Swan. And that was the first of Lulu's letters. And that afternoon, I sat down and wrote 4 years of letters that Lulu wrote to James Beard. Who, in the course of that, for me, as later I realized that one of the things that had been very interesting for me as a writer was to have James Beard be a big figure in this book, although you never hear from him. I mean, he looms very large, but I would not have presumed to have written James Beard's letters back to Lulu, so they're merely inferred. So I put these letters away. I didn't have any idea what I was going to do with them. And packed up my office, went home, and really did nothing for the next year except cook. And for me, it was a great joy to go back into the kitchen. And I had been cooking quick meals for my family, but now I really had the time to sort of wander around and go to farmers markets and go to Chinatown and Koreatown and pick up ingredients and just play around with them. And at the end of that year, I had sort of grounded myself again. And it was interesting because I had thought, when I went to work at Condé Nast, the life at Condé Nast, I'd been a daily journalist all my life. Journalists make nothing. I mean, I had never made 3 cents really. And when I went to Condé Nast, it was a life that I had never imagined. I mean, I had a driver who followed me around the city, even if I was only going 2 blocks. I had hair and makeup people who showed up every morning at my house to fluff me. I had a clothing allowance and a consultant to help me buy clothes. We never traveled anything but first class, stayed in all the best hotels. And I thought, now I've been Cinderella and I'm going to turn back into a pumpkin and it's going to be terrible. And one of the things I learned in that year was that it was not terrible. That, in fact, I had traded a lot of time for silly luxuries, and that having my time back was pretty wonderful. Anyway, at the end of that year, I was regrounded, and I got a call from an editor who said, "You should write a novel." And I said, well, I've always wanted to write a novel, but I'm not really sure I can. And she said, "Your memoirs all read like novels." And I said, well, yeah, except that they're based on fact. And she said, well, think about it this way. She said, when you were wearing those disguises at the New York Times, when you were doing all that stuff that you wrote about in Garlic and Sapphires, you weren't writing fiction, but you were living it. And all you have to do is imagine one of those characters and put her on the page instead of putting her on your body. And that kind of made sense to me. And I thought, okay, who do I want to be? And I thought it would be really interesting to be 21 years old. And 21 years old would be interesting to know what that was like now. It's a very different generation than my generation at 21. And, what if I, had someone who had a sister? I've never had a sister. I want her to have a sister. And, what if she's not like me? What if she's really shy and closed down? And, what if she's new to New York? So she's getting to discover this city in a way that I, as a New Yorker, never really did. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to create this character and I'm going to put her on the page. And then I remembered these letters. And I thought, what if she's really in trouble? Because that's, of course, what you do for fiction, right? You create a character and you put her in jeopardy. And I said, and what if her help comes from meeting this little girl who lived 70 or 75 years earlier? And what if I can sort of have this hand reach across time and be her salvation? And so that really was the genesis of this book. What I did not know, and I wish my editor had told me, was that there is nothing more complicated as a structure for a novel as to create 2 first-person heroines in 2 different times. So it was the writing of this book was fascinating for me as someone who has sort of been stuck with reality for all the time before this. And I absolutely, I found that once you get your characters, once you know who they are, once you really have them down, there is nothing more fun than writing fiction. So I will be doing that going forward. I would be happy to answer any questions that anybody has on anything. Okay, I think you have to ask it in at the microphone.
While everybody's coming towards, is there a I don't really cook a lot at all, but I had a friend who was from Hungary, and he always talked about paprikash, and he said that, and I've seen versions of paprikash. He's like, well, poor people make this amazing food, and fundamentally I've seen sort of variations of that, Mexican food, and you have tortillas, you have these sort of people who have limited means create amazing food. I've talked about it a lot in sort of parties, let's say. I have no idea whether this is something that's true or not, but what do you think?
Whether people who have limited means make amazing food?
With limited ingredients.
Many do. We live, to our shame, we live very high on the hog, and we ignore, just talking about animals, we ignore most of the most tasty parts of every animal. But it takes some. I, for instance, I was at a sushi bar last night, and the sushi-san, who knows that I will eat anything, said, here is a treat you will not have had before. These are sea cucumber guts. They were delicious, but my guess is that 99% of the people of means in this country probably would not want to eat that. And certainly, poor people learn to balance protein, to know that rice and beans, give you perfect protein. There is something to be said for necessity being the mother of invention. And actually, one of the best books on using, it's out of print now, but James Beard wrote a book called How to Eat Better for Less Money. It was a 35-cent paperback that he did in like the 50s. And it sort of covers everything, and no surprise, it's no longer in print.
Where are you from? What state are you from?
New York.
New York.
Hello, welcome to Washington.
Thank you.
As a writer, I find it difficult to lay out the outline and structure of large pieces. How did you do that when you laid out your characters and what they were going to be doing? Did you develop the characters individually? Did you have a loose structure in mind or where it was going?
This is an embarrassing revelation, but I actually wrote a novel and then threw it out because I didn't know that I needed to know the backstory of every character who walked through this book. And when I was done with what I thought was the novel, I realized what I had just been doing was learning the characters, that the readers didn't need to know everything that I needed to know, and that I had just written, I thought it was a book, but it was essentially a map of all of the characters, where they came from, what their childhoods were like. I mean, it was very, very complete information, but that's what I needed to know. I did not, having then anchored myself, I felt free to let them go places I didn't anticipate. So I did have an outline. It looks nothing like what the book actually is. I had a very different idea of what these characters would do, but once I knew them, I literally went into my studio every day, and it was like, what's going to happen to Billy today? I mean, they did things that I never in a million years would have anticipated. But I did have, a place I thought the book was going to go. I thought it was going to end up in a very different place. But for me, anyway, the real work of this was I spent a year really getting to know them. And after that, it was just pure fun.
Oh, thank you very much.
Sure. Nobody else?
I'll ask a question if there are no other takers. You've probably experienced this on your most recent book tour. There's nothing worse than being in a great new city and having no idea where to eat and being sort of left to the vagaries of random people or Yelp, which is a blessing and a curse. So how do you, when you're going to a new city, how do you decide where you're going to eat?
Well, I tend to ask people on Twitter. I mean, I tweet a lot. So I will send out a note on Twitter saying, where should I eat? Usually I will get really informed ideas back from people. I mean, much better than Yelp. And occasionally somebody from a local paper will say, you want to come eat with me? I've met a lot of people that way. I mean, I was in Toronto a couple days ago.
It's my hometown.
God, I ate so well in Toronto,
Oh,
but
it's
I
amazing.
didn't. I had no idea about any of those restaurants, and it all came through Twitter.
Oh, it's fantastic.
So I mean, I find social media kind of remarkable. But of course, I'm mostly food people are, following me and I follow them. So there's a real exchange there.
Thanks.
Sure.
I don't cook. I don't even boil.
And you say that so proudly.
Yeah, I don't even boil water. So what I wanted to ask you was, in order to stay alive, I eat out, and but I eat cheap. See, so I'm not a gourmet maven, But I was going to ask you, what are some good cheap places to eat at?
You're asking the wrong person about DC. I just don't know that much about Washington, but generally I end up in ethnic. I mean, my son, who loves to eat, eats almost exclusively ethnic food because he can't afford. He eats Korean food, he eats Mexican food, he eats on the street, he eats food cart food. I mean, there's amazing, at least in New York, there's I imagine there are probably really great food carts here where people are actually hand making wonderful food. Sorry, I wish I had a smarter answer for you.
So once you now that you're moving into fiction, do you think you might have another memoir in you, maybe about some of these extraordinary gourmet experiences that you were describing?
I actually have. When I started writing Delicious, I had a 3-book deal with Random House to write Delicious, to write a cookbook, which is kind of a memoir that it starts with the closing of Gourmet and goes through the year, and it's like each entry is my tweet, the diary of what was happening that day, and then the recipe that I've already turned in, and then the memoir of the Gourmet years, which I know everybody's sort of like waiting for that one, but I want a little distance. And then when I turned in Delicious, they said, "Oh, and now we want your next 2 novels too." So I'm working on the next novel.
I followed you for many, many years. I'm a big fan, and you've done some very different things within the genres of journalism and food, and I'm curious about how you reinvent yourself. You talked a little bit about spending this year in the kitchen, regrounding yourself, and I ask also as a journalist who's worked for institutions that no longer exist, and that feeling of being called in and you get this horrible news, and some people are wonderful about having this intuition about what they should do next, and other people like me are often like, oh my God, the mortgage is due next week, what the hell am I going to do? And I like take the first thing, and you have always very creatively gone on to something different and made it your own. How do you do that?
I can only tell you a couple of stories that sort of worked for me. I mean, one was when I got out of graduate school, and I have my background is history of art, and I really did think I would move to New York, and Museum of Modern Art would say, "Oh yes, we're looking for a new curator." In fact, what everyone said was, "How fast can you type?" And I had a job I loathed. And one day, one of my friends said to me, "You're such a good cook. Why don't you write a cookbook?" And I thought, "Oh, that's a great idea." And I went and I wrote an outline and a sample chapter, and I took it to a publisher and said, "I want to write a cookbook." And today they would laugh at you, but in 1971, the public, "Oh, what cookbook? What a quaint idea!" It was before the cookbook revolution. They didn't say, "Can you cook? Has anyone tested your recipes?" It was just, "Yeah, sure, we'll buy a cookbook from you." So I wrote a cookbook, and it was like very encouraging. "Oh, you can do whatever you want." Then after that, people, thought maybe I was a food writer. I thought maybe I was a writer. We moved to Berkeley, and I started a collective restaurant with a group of other people. I mean, people say I was a chef. This was not remotely a chef-like restaurant. We were a bunch of people who loved to cook, who, let's get together and open a restaurant kind of thing, which we did. But I also was still writing mostly about art. And one of my editors came into my restaurant for dinner most nights. And one night he just looked at me, and it was literally as if this light bulb had gone off over his head. And he said, "You're a much better writer than our restaurant critic, and you can cook, food. Have you thought about being a restaurant critic?" At the moment, I wasn't thinking, "Oh, I'm going to get a new job." All I was thinking was, they're going to pay me to go out and have a meal in a restaurant. I mean, we were so poor. The idea of getting a meal in a restaurant was so fantastic. I mean, that was all I was thinking, free meals. And I went home, and I was living in a commune, and I told my friends, we're going out to the fanciest restaurant in San Francisco. That's the restaurant they told us to do. So I've written about the first review I wrote, but I've never written about the second one, which was the one that really kind of changed my life. And so my friends all we all dress up very spiffily, and we go to a thrift store to get these new clothes, and we get into we're living in Berkeley, we have to go to San Francisco, and we get into my husband's van. My husband was an artist, and he had turned his van it was a windowless panel Chevy, and he had turned it into a camera obscura. So he put this panel of wood behind the driver's seats with a pinhole in it, and then put mattresses on the floor in the back and painted the walls white. So when you drove, the landscape was projected upside down in the back of the truck. So we all lie down in this and drive over to San Francisco to this restaurant. And of course, we can't give this vehicle to a valet. So we get out and we go into the restaurant. Now, I have since learned that the last thing you want as a restaurant critic is to have people helping you. But I didn't know that then. So they all really want me to get these free meals because they all want them too. So everybody's trying to be very helpful, and they're throwing information at me. Look at what that waiter did. One of my roommates was a great cook, is tasting everything and telling me, there's cumin in here and a little basil. And my artist's husband is like noticing the colors on the wall and the typography on the menu. And they're all just throwing this information. And I have this vision that we are a gang that's been sent by a rival restaurateur. And we drive back to Berkeley, and in this fit of inspiration, I go into my little studio and I write this piece, which the name of the restaurant was Robert, and I call the piece Cops and Robert. And I write basically a film noir script It begins, the names have all been changed to protect the innocent. And the review, the food is woven through it, but it's a short story with food in it. And the next day I drive over to back to San Francisco to give this opus to my editor. And on the way back to Berkeley, I suddenly realized what an idiot I've been. That this isn't a restaurant review, it's a dopey little short story. And I feel like none of my friends are ever going to talk to me again. I've blown all these fabulous free meals we were going to get. It's the stupidest thing I've ever done. And this is, of course, before cell phones. I get off the bridge, I go to the first payphone, throw all my money into it, and call my editor and say, John, don't read that. I picked up the wrong piece. I'm going home. I'll be right back with the real review. Now, how I thought I was going to write another review and get it back to him in an hour, I don't know. But anything to get him not to read this. And he says, it's too late. And my heart just sinks. I mean, I know I have just blown the best job I'm ever going to get. And he lets me suffer for a minute. And then he says, this is fantastic. This is just what we want. You have to remember, this is like, 1977, new journalism. He said, American restaurants are growing and changing, and the writing about them should too. So really, for the next 6 years, I wrote what I'm positive are the weirdest restaurant reviews ever written. I mean, I wrote Westerns, I wrote science fiction, I wrote things that were set in the 17th century, I wrote love stories, and they were just little stories. The point of telling you this is that these two experiences both taught me to take chances. I mean, I got away. I mean, if I had had another editor, I would have gone back to cooking in the restaurant, and I probably wouldn't be writing today. But I was just very lucky in that a few times I took chances, and it worked for me. And so the motto for me is take a chance, do things that you don't know how to do. I mean, it was the same when I went to Gourmet. I mean, when they hired me, I mean, what did I know about running a magazine? Nothing. But I thought, this is fantastic. I'm 50 years old, and I'm getting to do something I don't know how to do. How fantastic. I get to learn a whole new thing. So, I mean, that's all I can say is, take a chance, trust yourself, think out of the box. When you get fired from your magazine, write a novel.
Well, you came very, very close to answering my question with that answer, but I'll go ahead.
Okay.
You didn't quite. I was wondering whether your interest in writing preceded your interest in food and the nuances of food, or vice versa.
I grew up
have
in...
to dig back.
No,
way back
I
for
can
that.
answer that really, really easily. I grew up in publishing. My father was a book designer. He read every book he ever designed, and there were thousands of them. I mean, he started his career in this country in 1926 and was still working in 1980. So he brought books. He loved home and galleys. My mother had a bookstore. In our family, writing was the only thing that really mattered. And, the whole time that I was writing about food, my parents were saying, when are you going to write something that counts?
That suggests you were already thinking about food. So.
Yes, I mean, I was always cooking, and I wrote a cookbook when I was 21, and my parents were happy that I'd written a book, but I would have preferred that it be a book, not a cookbook.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
I love your books. You're so inspiring in the kitchen and in my creative life. It's really wonderful to see you here. And I'm just curious what your favorite restaurant is anywhere and why.
At the moment, and this changes all the time, but at the moment, Blue Hill at Stone Barns
Mine too.
is...
I had my favorite meal of my life there.
It's fantastic, and this is a time for me to make a pitch for Dan's book, which is just brilliant. I think it's... Dan Barber is the chef at Blue Hill at Stone Barns. He's written a book called The Third Plate. He is the most articulate chef in America today, and maybe the most articulate food writer. And he's asked a lot of really interesting questions. But in his restaurant, they raise everything that they serve. They recycle everything. The people who work there have stages where they work in the farm, they work in the fields. He's really thinking of the future of food in his restaurant, and the food is absolutely delicious.
Thank you.
Hi. About 7 years ago, I read Garlic and Sapphires with my book club, and about 2 weeks later, I was in Italy. I went into a bookstore off the Piazza Novana, and I saw this. Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I wanted to tell you a funny story. The woman there, the bookseller, I pulled it off the shelf, and I looked at it, and I went, huh. And then I realized what it meant. And I told her that I wanted to buy this for you.
Oh.
And she said, oh, you know her? And I guess my Italian's not that good, but she thinks we're friends.
Aren't we?
I feel like I know you. And she says, oh, no. She didn't want to charge me.
Oh.
She wanted me to give it to you because it's her favorite book. And and her favorite character was my favorite character. It's the bag lady.
Oh, Betty.
Because
yeah.
she goes, and then she said to me, did you cry? And I said, yeah, I cried. She goes, tell her I cried too. So it's taken a while, and I even braved that bridge from Virginia to be here, which is why I'm late.
Oh, that's so sweet.
But
Thank
I wanted
you.
to give this to you because she wanted you to have it.
Oh, well, thank you. This is actually the second Italian edition of this. My books sell very well in Italy. I don't know why.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I got to know you as the reviewer of restaurants for the New York Times, and I didn't actually, I have to confess, I didn't know you wrote a novel until my daughter told me and said, let's go to hear Ruth Reichl of Politics and Prose. So I'm thinking, when you review books, it's the chef and the restaurant that wants you to write a good review and get their customers that way, and you're giving your opinion. When you write a novel and you're doing a book tour, it's almost the reverse. And I'm wondering, in your career, what's it like to be sometimes the person who has the power to review and sometimes the person who's selling her wares and depends on other people's opinions of her work?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you that this book, the day the book was published, got maybe the meanest review ever written in the New York Times. I mean, it was brutal, and it was a moment for me, to sort of go out on the road and have this thing, this pretty humiliating review hanging over my head, and just sort of saying to myself, "Look, you did this for years. This is what it feels like," and but I mean, the truth is, if you like good reviews, then you have to take the bad ones too. And I can say happily that the New York Times Sunday review, which is coming out this Sunday, is like a full-out rave, so it takes the sting out of it somewhat. But I mean, there's no point in being a critic if you're going to pull your punches. And, as a critic myself, I kept trying to remind my readers that this is my opinion. There is no right or wrong in this, and especially with food, where, we're talking about things that take place in my mouth. And as someone who had many critics working for me at various times, the one rule I kept trying to say to other critics is the primary rule of reviewing, no matter what it is review what it is that the chef is trying to do, not what you wish he or she is doing. Sometimes you have an idea of what someone should do, and that is irrelevant What matters is, is the chef doing what he or she set out to do? And, the whole notion of criticism is really interesting, because it seems to me that what a good critic does is not be a consumer reporter. It's not really telling you how to spend your money. What a good critic does, whether it's art or music or film or food, is give the reader a way to enhance their experience. When you read a good review, you should be armed with tools that make you appreciate things you wouldn't otherwise appreciate. And that to me is what good criticism is, and that can encompass, both the positive and the negative.